So this is the third and last of the fall lectures for the UCLA Center for the Liberal Arts and Free Institutions. My name, by the way, is Daniel Lowenstein. I'm the director of that center, known fondly as CLAFI by its initials. And it's really been a good set of lectures so far, and looking forward to another good one tonight. I'm just working on the fall, on the winter spring program now, but hopefully there'll be an announcement on that sometime within the next month or so. Most of you are probably already on our distribution list, but if you're not and would like to be, so that you can find out about what's coming up next year, just send me an email. My email address is lowenstein@law.ucla.edu, and I'll be glad to put you on. In addition to these lectures, which usually take place on a Thursday night, although sometimes when we have people in different time zones, we're varying the times this year. We have on Saturday a seminar with the same person. The person who gave the lecture Thursday night leads a seminar. He or she asks the people usually to read something for the seminar, and then we sit there and discuss it. Occasionally it could be some music to listen to, or it can be some artworks to look at, but usually it's readings. And those are good events. They're more intimate, obviously more participatory, and because we keep them limited in size so that they will be conversations and not lectures, enrollment for those is necessary. And so if you get on the distribution list, you'll get the notice, advance notice of events, and then you can write to me and ask to be enrolled in the seminar. They usually fill up. We've had a fairly long waiting list for all the seminars this term, for example. So it's a good idea to get those requests in early. I try, for those who do get it in reasonable time, I try to be equitable. If there are too many people, I make sure that everybody gets into at least one or two. And I do give preference to UCLA students and faculty members. Otherwise, it's pretty much first come, first serve, subject to that kind of equitable thing. So that's what we do. We do a bunch of other things too. We sponsor some courses for UCLA students. We have various other activities, but the public events series is our public exposure, and very glad to have all of you with us this evening. Or if you happen to be in Australia, as our speaker is tonight, good afternoon. Just before I move on to introducing Calvin, I want to mention that for UCLA students who are here, there is a very good CLAFI student club that does a lot of things. For one thing, they provide invaluable assistance to us in operating these CLAFI events, but they also have many activities on their own. They have their own lectures, they have their own seminar discussions, they have movie nights, which are really wonderful. I've found that students are really good at thinking and talking about movies, and I've learned a lot from them from these movie nights. They have Jeopardy games. They just do a whole variety of things. So if you're a UCLA student and would like to find out about the club and possibly get involved in it, on your screen, actually, Ishani, do you want to just give your email address so that people know how to get in touch with you if they want to find out about the club?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm the president of the student club. So if you'd like to get involved, I'm going to put my email in the chat and CLAFI's email in the chat. Just please let us know if you'd like to come to our events and be added to our newsletter. We'll let you know of all of our coming events, and also we're on Facebook. So if you're interested in just staying up to date with everything that we're doing, then you can always find our information there.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Ishani. It's also the students that I work with in the club are just such a wonderful group of students. If you are a UCLA student, I think one of the big advantages of the club is just it's a great place to make friends and meet some just outstanding people who are with you. Well, not with you at UCLA. I can't say that right now, but virtually so. Okay, so turning to the event of the evening. Calvin is a professor in the philosophy department at UCLA. He specializes in philosophy in the medieval and early modern periods, and has written extensively about those in his lecture tonight. I'm sure we'll reflect that. He's also an honorary professor at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, a city in Australia, and was just mentioning to me and a couple of students before we came on that he went to Brisbane expecting to spend a week there in March, and he's still there. Mentioned that he's probably not the only person in the world who has had some plans changed this year, but it certainly has affected him. So you can see the beach behind him. We don't have to feel too sorry for him, I don't think, especially since he's just approaching summer. But he's also served as the chair of the UCLA Philosophy Department, and I'm proud to say that, or happy to say that he is a very valued member of the CLAFI Faculty Steering Committee at UCLA. So Calvin, it's a great pleasure to introduce you.
Now I'm unmuted, I think. Right. Thank you very much, Daniel. And it's a great pleasure to be here, even virtually. We'll see whether the pleasure is entirely mine or whether there's some for you as well. So I'm going to share my screen. If I can succeed in doing this. In these unprecedented times, all technical things need to be sort of thought through. Let me get this out of the way. Try this again. There we go. Okay, so my topic this evening is a very short history of natural rights. And I was thinking of it in the same way that one might think of, half-hour Shakespeare, where one tries to get the entire corpus of Shakespeare into 30 minutes or at least one evening. It can be fun, but of course, a great deal gets left out, and some of the most important things get left out. And so that's how it's going to be here. I'm happy, by the way, to take questions even during the presentation, but I won't be able to see them. So I'm hoping that Michael or Ishani or Daniel, who can monitor the chat, will tell me if a question that should be taken in the talk rather than after the talk comes up. I can't see the chat at the same time as doing what I'm doing here. That's part of the price of having arrived here expecting only to be a week, so not having all the equipment I would otherwise have. Okay, so let's see if I can advance this PowerPoint. There we go. So let me begin with a quote from Brian Tierney, who's one of the great historians of the history of rights. And because I think it says what I need to say, namely that you can't actually write a history of natural rights at the moment. The concept itself is still being very much disputed. The history of the concept is disputed. The current meaning of right is disputed. And although, as we'll see, the notion is extremely important, as Brian points out, there are philosophers, important philosophers like Alistair MacIntyre, for example, who claim there's no such thing, right? MacIntyre is quoted as saying there are no such rights, and belief in one is one with belief in witches and unicorns. Witches reminds me of Theo Wies's talk a couple of weeks ago, which I'm afraid I'll not be able even nearly to rival. So hold on to your seats for a very quick tour. Okay, so everybody agrees that rights are important, right? So here's a text from something that you know better than I, since I'm a Canadian, right? The beginning of the Declaration of Independence, and I've outlined, I've bolded a number of portions that contain the notion of rights, right? So endowed by their creator, we'll come back to that, I hope, with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then the claim is that governments are instituted to secure these rights and derive their powers from the consent of the governed. So, but then later on, we get this notion of the right of the people, right? Not the right of each person, but the right of the people to alter and abolish any particular form of government. So this I think indicates the central role that this notion has played from the beginning in US life in particular, and more recently, I think, in other lives. So here's, for example, the beginning of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was formulated soon after the Second World War, the key drafters of whom were a Canadian and a guy from Lebanon, actually. But you can see that at least there's a kind of echo of the Declaration of Independence here. All right, now, rights have suddenly become very controversial indeed, right? So here's a picture from a rally back in April, right, where somebody is claiming perfectly well, right, my body, my choice, and the choice is not to wear a mask, right? So the thought is, this right, the right to my body, is connected somehow with it being my choice and the right not to wear a mask. The person happens to be a Trump supporter, but I'm sure I could find examples from others as well. Okay, now there is an issue about rights. I mean, there are a series of paradoxes which I think demonstrate, or at least come close to demonstrating, there's a certain amount of complication that you can't actually have a full-blooded set of rights and at the same time have what you might call a universal democracy. So one of the most famous is what people sometimes call the paradox of the Parisian liberal, or Sen's paradox, after Amartya Sen, who was the person who invented it, or who proposed it, I guess. And this is actually Sen's original example. He says, look, suppose there's a racy book. I think he had Lady Chatterley's Lover in mind. And suppose there are four options. No one reads it. Someone he calls the libertine reads it. Someone he calls the prude reads it, or both read it. And suppose that the libertine prefers that both read it to any of the others, but prefers that prude read it to him or her reading it, because she thinks that it'll do prude some good. And if not prude, then she'd like to read it herself. And her least favorite option is that no one reads it. But prude, on the other hand, has almost the reversed preferences, prefers that no one reads it, prefers that he reads it, let's suppose, to libertine, thinking it'll do him less harm, prefers next that libertine read it, and prefers least that both read it. Now, you can see that both of them prefer that prude reads it to libertine reading it. And so on any ordinary choice function, you'd have it that their miniature society, consisting of just the two of them, prefers that. But now suppose that libertines has the right to read it or not, the right now, in a sense that's contemporary to us, I think. Then libertine gets to choose between no one reading it and libertine reading it, and prude gets to choose between no one reading it and prude reading it. Since libertine prefers that libertine read it to no one reading it, the society should prefer that. right? Because that's libertine's right. And since Prude prefers that no one read it to Prude reading it, the society should prefer that. And so now the society prefers that no one read it, to that Prude read it, that Prude read it, to that libertine read it, and that libertine read it, to that no one read it. So there's no way to make these preferences consistent. Now, when Sen introduced this paradox, his thought was that there's a tension between the notion of a right as it's understood here and what you might call Pareto optimality, something that everyone would prefer, or at least that no one would disprefer. And there's something to it. There's been a huge literature about this, and I'll be glad to come back to it in the question period if anyone cares to. But first, now, there are two ways of doing the history of a concept, right? And I've started badly, I think, by my own reckoning, by beginning at the end. The other, and working backwards. So one takes, for example, the concept one finds around one and attempts to see what in the past actually corresponds to it. The other option is to start with the invention of a concept, which usually gets reflected simply in the invention of a word, and try to trace it forward. Now, this is very difficult in the case of natural rights, because, of course, the language in which people did all this for well over a millennium was Latin. In some ways, that Latin was reflecting even a Greek antecedent. And finally, there were vulgar languages, as people call them, vulgates, in which translated that Latin, including into English. So I just wanted to point out that right, as the translation of the Latin jus, already is found in 1572 in a dictionary, and in a way that might seem rather familiar. So the examples given in this dictionary are in English, to leave his right to anyone, in Latin, jus aliqui remittere, and in French, picter son droit à quelqu'un, right? So, of course, this French and English being at the time still used in England. Okay, now, so jus, it looks like, is the term that even in the 16th century was being translated as right. And we'll come back to jus in a second, because it's the important word I think we have to think about here. But there's also the question of whether we should translate jus as law. And you'll find this already in translations of Roman jurists. For example, Ulpian, the 3rd century Roman jurist, in the Digest, which gets repeated in Justinian's Institute, has that jus naturale is that which nature teaches to all animals. But if you look at translations, you'll typically find that it's natural law is what nature has taught all animals. Now, this, I think, is a significant business. And if you read the secondary literature on this subject, you'll find people almost always prepared to say, well, jus can mean law and it can mean right, and really it doesn't exactly mean either, and so on, right? So I think we have to be very careful here, because the history of the notion of natural right is closely connected with the question of the proper translation of the word jus, okay? And how it's connected to another Latin word, lex, which we almost always translate as law, no matter what else we do. So one of the great topics in the history of thinking about natural rights is, when did the notion of right come to have the connotation it has to us of it being something which is a property of an individual or a community, and which reflects the power of that individual or community to do or not do something. Okay, so that's a key issue that people have debated for as long as people have been trying to figure out what the history of natural rights is. And it's closely connected, say I, with this question of how to translate jus. Okay, so for example, in the Decretum of Gratian, this peculiar 12th century canon lawyer, church lawyer who put together the collection of texts which became the basis of church law in the Middle Ages. Gratian, following a late 6th and early 7th century writer, Isidore of Seville, claims that custom is a certain kind of jus. I've left the Latin words here, established by mos, which is the root from which mores, right, and morals comes, and received as lex, i.e. law, when there is no lex, right? And it doesn't matter whether it's confirmed in writing or by reason, since reason confirms law. That's the Latin accusative. So if lex is confirmed through reason, then lex will be all that reason has established. So you can see already the thought is that jus, established by mos and received as lex, if it's confirmed by reason, right, then has the force of law, right? And so the question now is law just a kind of jus then? So there are many kinds of jus, or is jus kind of, another way, so to speak, of expressing what we express with law? Now, law itself, right, is a peculiar word, right? Its etymology is contested, but it seems to derive from Old Norse and from Proto-European, and it seems to have had the sense of fixing something, making it stable, setting it down, straightening it perhaps. And that, of course, is a sense that we find in lots of medieval thinking about justice and rex and rectitudo. So law is, say I, part of a family of words that sort of straddle the boundary between describing things and prescribing them, which is why, for example, even now, we have the notion of a law of nature as well as a law laid down by a legislator, for example. Why do we use the same word? Well, there's a history behind that too. This is not that talk, but it's partly because law is one of those words that we can describe, that we can think of as describing the way things are, as we do in laws of nature, or prescribing them. Normal is another such word, standard is another such word, and so on. And of course, jus will turn out, I think, to be another such word. Okay, so now, what about natural law? Okay, now, in this work that was discovered in the 19th century by Cicero, I mean, it had been lost for a long time, except for a famous part of it, so-called Dream of Scipio. We find the claim that true law is right reason in agreement with nature. And then Cicero goes on to claim it's universal, it's unchanging, it's everlasting, right? It doesn't lay its commands or prohibitions upon good men in vain, but it does upon the wicked, who will, after all, not pay any attention. And we find out that there's, according to Cicero now, not a Christian thinker, there's a God over all of us who is the author of this law, its promulgator, and its enforcing judge, right? And whoever is disobedient in fleeing from himself, notice that, and denying his human nature, will be in some way punished. So it looks like what we're getting is this thought that right reason, agreement with nature, the nature in question is partly human nature, and in fleeing from it, you flee from yourself. So we're getting this thought now that law, and by the way, Cicero, in at least some of the texts I was looking at, the word here is jus, not lex, is proposing that there's this jus or lex, which is unchanging. It's laid down by some lawgiver, perhaps not a Christian God, but perhaps a Stoic thought that this is the reason itself immanent in the universe. It agrees with human nature, and it lays an onus on us. It calls to us in some way. And our goodness is partly a function of how it calls to us. Here, by the way, is a slightly different translation of this. Now, I thought I'd So true law is right reason in agreement with nature, says this one. But there is a true law, a right reason conformable with nature, in this one. And you can see again, the Latin doesn't have as many words as English, and the Latin grammar often admits of more than one English translation. And you can get people thinking, well, what Cicero is committing himself to here is that there is such a law. What he's committing himself here is that this law is right reason, right? So slightly different ways of thinking about it. Okay, so already by say the beginning of the common era, we have a claim that there's some connection between this notion of jus and law, and that this connection is connected with nature, and that nature is connected with something divine, perhaps the laying down of something of an immanent reason in the universe. That would be the Stoic way of thinking about it. So now let me try to trace forward a little bit how this notion develops and say something about the controversies that have emerged about it. Okay, so the word we're looking at is jus, I-U-S, right? And it is the noun whose abstract form is justitia. And of course, in Latin, particularly in medieval Latin, that which we represent I is often actually written with a little curl on it and pronounced the way we pronounce a J. So jus, justus, justitia, justice, obviously, right? And there's a debate actually about whether the abstract form, justitia, came first or whether it was the concrete form, jus or jus, that came first. And by the way, just as a matter of peculiarity, I've not been able to trace this, but as far as I can tell, it's the same word from which we get juice. And I really do not know how this came to pass, right? I can sort of make up fake etymologies, but I leave it to someone who might have some insight into this, what juice might have to do with justice. Okay, now what is a jus or a use then? Well, it's an incorporeal thing, right? So apparently. So in his topics, Cicero describes the use of seizure, the usus capionem, and this which is a way of getting property as a incorporeal thing. And if you look then at at the end of the 19th century, you get people taking this to mean that when someone says something is mine, it might be a corporeal thing, like a piece of land or an animal, or it might be an incorporeal thing, as a jus utendi fruendi, a use of using and of enjoying or benefiting from. And obligations would also be classed among incorporeal things. So it looks like people had come to think anyway of jus as a thing of a certain kind, right? Something that is not a physical thing, but nonetheless something that could be grasped by thought, a part of the metaphysics or the ontology of the world, if you like. Now, if we fast forward, because after all, this is supposed to be a very short history, you find in Aquinas the idea that a jus is an incorporeal thing. He says that, but it's an incorporeal thing which meets certain conditions, right? And now you get a debate among contemporary to us scholars about exactly what's going on here. So people will say, for example, that the jus to a field consists of the field plus certain features or properties of the field, like that you can use it in a certain way or that you're allowed to sell it, for example, right? And now when Aquinas turns to the abstract form, justitia, he claims that it has a special object over and above the other virtues. And this object, that is, so what justice or justitia is about, is called the just thing, the justum, which is the same thing as a jus. So the thought that Aquinas seems to be pressing is that what a jus is it's something which is useful. It's a just thing. And people have made a lot of this, pointing out that there's no proper hint in Aquinas that a jus is something that I, so to speak, can exercise or not exercise or anything like that. If I have a jus, there's a rightfulness, and I would be expected by the law of nature or the law of the land to exercise this jus, right? And it might not even be up to me to exercise it. It might be just a state in which I happen to be. Okay, now, there's another piece of the story. So one of the background issues that come up here is what's the connection between jus and what you might call my powers to use a jus. So if you translate a jus as right, what's the connection between a right and my having it and being able to exercise it or not? Right? There's nothing so far that we've seen which suggests anything about my having any sort of special relationship here. It's a rightful thing. It might apply to me. It might apply to you. It might apply to, animals for all we've known so far, right? After all, we had that quote earlier in which there's a natural law or a natural right which applies to all animals, right? So where did this idea that we have that we have something like a right which we can exercise or not, right? We can wear a mask or not wear it. We can where did that very thought sort of come from? Right? It looks to me as though it comes from a connection that begins to be drawn between the Latin word jus and another Latin word, dominus, which is typically translated as Lord, right? Or master sometimes. Now, this is an old word in Latin, and it applies to all kinds of cases. But towards the end of the imperial period, it began to be applied to the emperor. And so in the 3rd century, begin to find people, emperors, calling themselves dominus. It's difficult to know who exactly did it first. Aurelian, who it looks like in the year CE 274, printed a coin or minted a coin in which he was described as Deus et Dominus natus, God and born God and Dominus, right? And Diocletian, at the beginning of the next century, probably even at the end of the 3rd, officially takes the title of Dominus. Now, the significance of this, as far as I can tell, is that these emperors at this point were claiming the empire as their property, right? So they're claiming that this is theirs. And that's new, both in Roman political life and jurisprudence. I mean, Julius Caesar would never have dared to suggest that the Republic was his, whatever titles he might have gotten. But it also suggests something else because it connects the notion of the things that the emperor can do to this notion of mastery or ownership of the empire. And if we fast forward to Aquinas, we'll find Aquinas claiming, and this goes back now to our notion of a natural jus, that man has a natural dominium, right? The noun formed from dominus, over external things. And why? Well, now we get, because by his reason and will, he's able to use them for his own profit as they were made on his account, for the imperfect is always for the sake of the perfect. So this is the basis in Aquinas's thought for the thought that we have a special connection to nature which other parts of nature don't have, and that connection is dominion, right? We are masters, we are owners of nature on Aquinas's view. Now, this is interesting because, of course, it's part of Aquinas's view that we're not, if you like, the original owner, right? God makes nature, on Aquinas's view, and then God gives us dominion. So we are subordinate masters or lords. We're masters or lords in holding this lordship or ownership from the real or the original dominus, right? Who's God. And if you go back to this thought here, it looks like what the emperors were claiming at the end of the empire was that any dominus at Rome actually held his, or occasionally her, Roman law did allow domina, to hold what they held in relation to the emperor's holding. Right. So in Aquinas's way of thinking, although I doubt he sort of thought this quite like this way, God is emperor of the universe, and we hold dominion from God, right? That's the thought. Now, this raises the question of whether, if you go back, you can see that the thought is that man, i.e. humans, have a natural dominion over external things. Man as a species, if you like, because hominis is common gender in Latin, but everybody in English always uses the masculine. Because we can use them for our profit, right? Okay, now this raises the question of whether originally there was any such thing as private property. And Aquinas wants to claim that there is a problem here, right? So he considers this objection. He says, according to the natural law, this is in his commentary on the sentences, actually, or did I? No, this is from the second part of the second part of the Summa. All things are common property, and the possession of property is contrary to this community of goods. Therefore, it's unlawful for anyone to appropriate any external thing to himself. And this is an objection that he finds in Basil, whom was a father of the church and a saint, right? And so it's something that Aquinas has got to deal with. And remember, and you can see what the objection is. The objection is that if we held everything in common at the beginning, then how is it that it's lawful for anyone to appropriate any external thing to himself? Now, if you go back to the distinction that Cicero and others were drawing between corporeal things and incorporeal things, that's still a distinction among external things. So it's not merely that that the problem is, can we, appropriate a field? The problem is, can we appropriate, say, an obligation or a permission or anything of those? So Aquinas answers that he thinks that the natural law doesn't positively hold that things have to be held in common, but leaves it up to humans to decide how things will be held. And here's the quotation, right? Not that the natural law dictates that all things should be possessed in common and nothing should be possessed of one's own, but because the division of possessions is not dictated, if you like, by the natural law, but rises from human agreement. So that's Aquinas. Okay, and I might just add one more thing. He says two things apply to man in respect of exterior things. One is the power to procure and dispense them, right? And secondly, because human affairs are conducted in a more orderly fashion, if each one is charged with taking care of some particular thing himself, then private property, Aquinas thinks, can be justified on what you might call grounds of public utility. Now, Aquinas is working with a particular sense of common. So here are two senses of common, right? Something is common or is in common if it's jointly held, right? So we hold things in common if we all have some say in them, let's say for the moment. The second sense is something is common if it's not held at all, right? The sense of commons that might, it's a good question, I don't know the answer, have been part of what was going on in some small New England towns. Aquinas is going for the second sense. He wants to claim that originally, naturally, nothing was held by anyone. We were given it all, but not as in any sense property. And that's where things hit the fan, right? So Aquinas dies in 1274, and the generation after has a lot of trouble with him. He nearly gets declared a heretic, in fact, and is only saved, I think, partly by the power of his order. So Godfrey of Fontaine, who's a secular master, as they say, that is, he doesn't belong to any religious order. Of course, he's a priest. They all were at the University of Paris. Instead of going for the sense that Aquinas goes for the other sense. He says, by the use of nature, iure naturae, each of us now has a certain dominium in the external things of this world. And what's more, it's a dominium and a jus and a dominium, right, which he's not able to renounce licitly. He can't actually, without sort of doing something wrong, give it up. So here we're getting a straightforward connection between having a jus and having dominium. Whoops, let me go back. And right, that which is what I'm going to claim is a significant thing, but also a connection between that and what you might call an inalienability, right? We can't licitly give it up. And this, he's writing this right at the very end of the 13th century. I don't think we can date, I think it's 1287 is the closest we can come, but I'm not sure that that's quite right. Okay, now this sets the stage, though it's not directly part of the great debate that scholars and everyone else, I think, who's thought about this have been focused on for a long time, namely the so-called poverty controversy. So here's how the poverty controversy begins. At the beginning of the 13th century, two great orders of priests and brothers to some extent, but mostly priests, are founded in the Christian church. And they're founded as begging orders, right? That's their original thought. One is founded by Dominic Guzman, the other by Francis of Assisi, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Now they go separate ways. From very early on, the Dominicans maintain, yes, no particular member of the order can hold property, but the order has no problem holding property at all. The Franciscans, on the other hand, are much more impressed with the idea that not even the order should hold property. And there's a kind of serious debate within the order about whether or not the order could hold property at all. And this became a kind of particular concrete debate because, of course, people would die and they'd leave the order things in their will and so on and so on. So the so-called spiritual wing of the Franciscans maintained that, properly speaking, the order should not hold any property. And indeed, they went further and suggested that the church shouldn't have property. And indeed suggested that property was not really what Christ and his disciples really thought people should have at all in the ideal circumstance. And that before the fall, there was no such thing as property, right? Okay, now this becomes a burning issue when one of the Franciscans, a man named Berengar of Talon, gets asked by the Dominican inquisitor, Jean de Bon, what to make of the claims of a certain Beguine, a kind of woman who is not part of any religious order, but evinces a certain special sort of spirituality, what to make of her claim that Christ and the disciples held nothing in common and had no property at all. And Berengar says that that's exactly what his order claims, and that's right. And Jean de Bon at that point excommunicates him, and Berengar appeals to the Pope. Okay? Okay, now all this goes back to this issue about what was the Franciscan order to do, given that as it read Francis, even the order perhaps was to hold no property. Well, what the Franciscans did was they worked out a deal with the Pope, whereby the Pope actually held any property, was the dominus, and held the ius to any property that that was given to the Franciscan order. But the Pope allowed the order to use the property, but did not, according to the Franciscan way of thinking about this, give the order any ius in the property. Right? So they were using it, but they had no, well, perhaps one could say, right to it? That's a good question, right? Okay, so that's the way things stood when this issue about Berengar came up. But now, exactly what are we to make of this? Well, Duns Scotus, who was a Franciscan and one of the great ones, right, sort of works this out in some detail, just at the moment when this sort of thing is beginning to get serious, just at the moment when Berengar's thing is happening, a little bit later actually, but not much. So he raises the question in his commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, which was the canonical textbook that every theologian had to sort of write a commentary on as a kind of PhD thesis. He says, I raised the question, what's the source of private property, distinct dominium, right? Such that this is called mine and yours. And for all injustice arises from this. And he lays down some theorems, right? He says, in the state of innocence, i.e. before Adam and Eve fell, neither divine nor natural law are allowed private property. On the contrary, everything was common. And he says that this is according to right reason, because if everyone was being reasonable or rational, I'm not sure which is the right way to think about it, then humans should have the use of things in such a way as first to contribute to a peaceful and decent life, and second to provide necessary sustenance. But in a state of innocence, common use with no private property would have been the right way to do this, because we would have all gotten along. Nobody would have taken more than they needed. And if you saw that your neighbor needed it more than you, you'd give it to your neighbor, right? That was the thought. And now Scotus goes on to say that after the fall, after Adam and Eve, ate of the fruit, this law of nature holding all things in common, right? Notice the second, not the Aquinas reading, but the Godfrey of Fontaine reading, was revoked. And given this revocation, it was now okay to have private property, but it was not required that a community have private property. Okay, there's still no actual division imposed by either divine or natural law. Now remember, if the connection between jus and dominium is the one I suggested earlier, the claim that there's now allowed to have private property would amount to the claim that it's now possible for an individual to hold a jus, right? But there's no requirement that the individual hold a jus, right? Okay, so now we get a long debate. What happens in that issue that I mentioned earlier is that after he's excommunicated by the Inquisitor, Berengar appeals to the Pope. Now, the Pope is the most controversial Pope probably in the history of Christendom. So controversial that there wasn't another John for 700 years after him. John the 23rd, right in the second half of the 20th century, took the title deliberately to sort of end, the endless debate over John the 22nd, right? Okay, John the 22nd was a canon lawyer. In fact, he was as they say, a doctor of both laws. He was an extraordinarily well-trained lawyer in both civil law, Roman law, and church law. Okay, so what John does is he goes back to Aquinas and beyond, and he concludes that it is heretical to claim that Christ and the apostles did not have a jus in anything. right? That was and so heretical to complain that they didn't have a dominium in anything, that they weren't masters and had rights in that sense, right? So he issues a series of bulls, of proclamations to that effect. Now, what's going on at this moment is that this is being played out at the papal court. The papal court is not in Rome, actually, it's in Avignon, because there are rival claimants to the throne, but to the papal throne. But John the 22nd is recognized in both England and France as the rightful pope. So all that's going on in Avignon, where he's got his court. And the Franciscan order is called there to defend their side of this, okay? And so the superior general of the order, Michael of Cesena, is there, and the lawyer, the attorney general, if you like, of the order, Bonagrazia, is there as well. And Occam, as it happens, is being accused of heresy back in Oxford by the former chancellor of Oxford. So he's sent off to Avignon to have his case examined. So this is now 324. And he gets there. The superior general recognizes a smart guy when he sees him and puts him to work defending the Franciscan side of this case. And so although he's being sort of, the proceedings about whether he's a heretic go on, by the way, they end with nobody ever settling that question. Occam is working on this, right? And so what happens then, finally, is that the Pope decides against the Franciscans, and all three of the Franciscans I just mentioned leave Avignon without permission, and the Pope excommunicates them for that, not for heresy, but for leaving without permission. And they go and seek the protection of the Holy Roman Emperor, Louis of Bavaria, who is actually at war with the Pope at this time. And so John takes this opportunity to now take on the challenge of answering SCOTUS properly. And so here's what John argues in this bull, qui ver reprobus, because a man who's a reprobate, right? Because a certain reprobate man. Those are the first words of the bull. John argues these theses. That God's dominion over the earth is the same conceptually as man's dominion over possessions. That Adam had by himself dominion, not collectively, but dominion privately, if you like, dominion over temporal things, and that a history can be told of how this dominion that Adam had was passed on then to everyone after him, right? And so John draws the conclusion that then that property, dominion, is natural to man, and that it's sustained by divine law and is unavoidable. And again, if you go back to the identification of dominion with jus, you draw the conclusion now that right is essentially applies to an individual and or maybe to a corporation, right? But it's not, so to speak, a collective thing en général, so to speak, and that it's unavoidably so. There's no such thing, if you like, as avoiding having a private right in that sense, right? So even the isolated consumption of goods, even if you sort of take an apple off a tree that happens to be growing in the middle of a forest, what you're doing is you're claiming a dominion over it in the course of doing that. And so you're claiming a jus with respect to it, right? That's the thought. Okay, now, so far so good. And we're back. Now, there's a long story to be told, getting us from this period at the beginning of the 14th century up to the late 16th, but I'm going to pass over it because I want to focus on a particular set of things, right? So if you'll notice that back there when we looked at Godfrey of Fontaine, Godfrey was saying that there was no way that one could illicitly give up one's dominion, right? The particular dominion that one had in the state of nature. Of course, once civil law was established, it might allow for other kinds of dominion and so on and so on. But the dominion to your life and your liberty, which you had in the state of nature, you couldn't licitly give up. So Hugo Grotius, who was the great theorist at the Dutch theorist from the beginning of the 17th century, challenges this. Right? And in his great book on the right of war, De Jure Belli, right, sometimes called the law of war, you can see why again, he says it's lawful, rightful, right, for any man to engage himself as a slave to whom he pleases, as appears both by the Hebrew and Roman laws. And why should it not therefore be lawful for a people that are at their own disposal to deliver themselves up to one or more persons and appoint a governor who would control them? So Grotius's thought is that you can give up your liberty. Now, he hasn't yet said it, but you can give up your life. But remember, Godfrey sort of ran these two together, right? So Grotius's thought is you can voluntarily make yourself a slave, and he's thinking that you can voluntarily submit yourself to an absolute ruler. Okay, now, so he allows what you might call an unrestricted transfer of your liberty and everything else, but he has only a limited right of self-defense. So although you can transfer any right that you have, you can't apparently just kill anyone who attacks your rights, right? And his argument here is very odd. He says it's because it might, the life of the person who's attempting to punish you, let's say, or to take over your right or to attack you or whatever, is it might turn out to be more useful than your own. Okay, so at this point, what we've got is the thought that you can transfer any right that you've got, right? Because you can make yourself a slave, and so you can give up any right that you might have had, except maybe your right to life. We haven't said anything about that. You don't, however, have an unlimited right to self-defense. So now the question is, do you have any unalienable or inalienable rights? And this is, I think, where Hobbes comes into the picture. So Hobbes claims that everyone has a liberty to make use of his natural faculties according to right reason. And why? Well, because the fundamental thing that one has is a liberty to protect one's own life. And so it seems Hobbes is committed then to the view that you would have no liberty to transfer your right to protect your life. Why? Well, because the only ground that you could have for doing it would be to protect your life, but then you wouldn't really be giving up the right to protect your life, or so he seems to think. And I'll gladly say more about that if we get a chance. Okay, now, so in De Cive, or Cive, right, he says, this is the English version, he says, it's in vain for a man to have a right to the end if the right to the necessary means is denied him. It follows that since every man hath a right to preserve himself, he must be allowed a right to use all the means and do all the actions without which he cannot preserve himself. And the Latin, by the way, is jure there, right? So what we've got now is the thought that we've got a right to preserve ourselves, and we've got a right to whatever is required to preserve ourselves. And of course, Hobbes goes on as part of his political theory to suggest that in order to do this, we are allowed to give up all our other rights to the sovereign if that turns out to be useful. Okay, but we now have still this thought that there's an inalienable right to preserve yourself, which wasn't Grotius's thought, or maybe it was, he didn't say. But that the right to liberty, which we saw, for example, in Godfrey of Fontaine, is transferable now. It's something that we can give up. Okay, now, we haven't yet said anything about equality. Godfrey did have something to say about equality, but we haven't said anything more. And if you turn to John Locke now, writing 2 generations after Grotius and a little bit after Hobbes's death, he says there's nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank, born promiscuously, as he puts it, to all the same advantages of nature and use of the same faculties, should also be equal to one another. And Locke follows that up, again, by insisting that we have, after all, an inalienable right to liberty, right? So here he says, a man not having the power of his own life, so not being able to alienate his life, cannot enslave himself to anyone or put himself under the absolute power of anyone. Why? Because you can't give any more power than you've got, and he that cannot take away his own life cannot give another power over it by making himself a slave. So what Locke is doing is he's connecting the inalienability of your right to life with your with the inalienability of your liberty. And you can see we're getting closer now to what you might think of as our own conception of a right. But, and here's the key move. Locke gets, I think from Grotius, but I've never been able to trace this properly, Locke claims that there's a natural right to punish. Now, notice that what we don't have is a right to transfer our liberty, because that would amount to transferring the power over our life, and we don't have power over our life because our life is inalienable. And notice that, therefore, the use that we have to our life, the right, because this is now in English, is not something we can give up. It's not at our disposal to do it or not. And so this whole tradition denies that there's any right of suicide, right? There's no use to suicide, because the use is a use to preserve your life. It's not a use to preserve it or not, as you will, right? Okay, so now this right to punish. Grotius does something which I'm embarrassed to say I once did myself, right? I remember, to my shame, a moment in the common room when I was a young assistant professor at Princeton, when I allowed that if someone committed a crime, they forfeited their rights. And I'm so embarrassed to think back, 1978, I think it was, and there were people there who I'm sure still remember this. So Grotius, however, wants to claim that since no one is able to transfer a thing he never possessed, it's evident that the right of chastisement, i.e. the right to punish, was held by private persons before it was held by the state, because otherwise the state would not have the right to punish, on Grotius's view, because the state only has rights that are given to it by its citizens. So on Grotius's picture, the state is the collection of citizens, or organized in a certain way, but the jura that it has all come from the citizens. Now, he takes it as obvious that the state can punish crimes. Therefore, he concludes that the individual citizens do. And since the individual citizens must have had this right then before there was a state, logically speaking, if not temporally speaking, then it must be the case that in nature we have a right to punish a criminal. And this, curiously enough, becomes the basis for the justification of slavery. Strange though it may be. So the thought is, look, this makes it lawful for a man to kill a thief who hasn't in the least hurt him, nor declared any design upon his life, any further than by the use of force so as to get him in his power, so as to take away his money or whatever he pleases. So even though somebody may just be, so to speak, holding my arm behind my back to take my wallet, it's lawful for me to kill him. So should it turn out that some African did something at some point, then it was perfectly okay for someone to kill him, presumably a fellow African. And if that fellow African then chose to enslave him instead, and remember, the Europeans on the whole did not enslave folk in Africa, they bought slaves from people who did, then somebody could buy that slave with a perfectly clear conscience, because they had been rightfully enslaved by someone whose right this slave to be had infringed, right? If I can kill the person, I can take away his liberty for the reasons we've just seen. Okay, so you can see where we've gotten. We've gotten all the way now from the thought that there's a jus, through the thought that this jus is connected with a dominion, to the thought that this dominium can be held by a private person, to the thought that there's something which is inalienable about the use that a private person has, to the thought that somebody nonetheless has a right to punish someone, and that punishment can even consist of undoing what the person couldn't do themselves, i.e. alienate their right to life. And of course, Locke is the background to the Declaration of Independence and to Jefferson. And so Jefferson, of course, in the Declaration accuses King George of taking away the rights of Americans who had not in any way done anything to him, and so of doing things that are against the natural law, against the natural right, the natural use, and so justifying the rebellion. And Thomas Hutchison, who was the governor of a former governor actually, writing about the Declaration, says, look, I could wish to ask the delegates of Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas how their constituents justify the depriving more than 100,000 Africans of their right to liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and to some degree their lives, if these rights are so absolutely unalienable. And of course, I think the answer, as Jenny Welshman, I think, showed for Locke, is that for Locke and perhaps for Jefferson, if the enslaved ones turn out to be criminals that you don't really have to check, then all bets are off. Jefferson, by the way, attempted to put into the Declaration of Independence a clause making slavery illegal in the Americas, but it seems to have gotten taken out before the thing was finally passed. And of course, everyone knows he himself kept slaves, and I think that's a different matter, because I suspect he thought that they would be no better off if he didn't keep them, but that's another story. Okay, so that's the historical part that I want to tell. Now, I'm going to take 5 minutes more and say something about the contemporary to us conception of right and how it plays out. So when people talk about rights these days, what they're thinking about typically is a picture that the American jurisprudent Wesley Hohlfeld developed at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And on Hohlfeld's picture, a right has 4 components. It consists of what he called a privilege, which is a liberty to do something. What he called a power, which includes the power to transfer that privilege or permission to somebody else. What he called a claim, God, my typing's terrible, which was an obligation, as I would say, but he didn't put it that way, on others to respect these things, and what he called an immunity. Now, the key notions here are the permission, which the holder of the right has, and the claim, which imposes an obligation on, or a duty on the part of others to the holder of the liberty, right? So on the Hohlfeldian conception, every right has these 2 components. You hold the liberty, but then I have an obligation to respect that liberty. Now, these are separable, right? So the example I like to think about is in a sport, right? So I grew up playing hockey. So in a sport like hockey, right, I have a liberty within the rules of the game to skate down the ice with the puck on my stick and attempt to score a goal. I don't have a right in the Hohlfeldian sense, because I have no claim on you. You can perfectly well stop me if you're a defenseman on the other team. So a Hohlfeldian right involves a power over the liberty, and it involves a obligation on the part of others. So to have a Hohlfeldian right is to have a dominion over your own liberty. I don't have to skate down the ice. I can, go off the rink if I want. And this is the conception that has come now into the late 20th and early 21st century. So here's the what I think is probably the most dramatic use of this by Robert Nozick in the late 20th century, right? Here's Nozick's claim that individuals have rights, and there's nothing that any group or person can do to them without their consent. That's the Hofeldian conception. There are first order rights, for example, my right not to be killed, but then there are also higher order rights, like the right to transfer my rights, or the right to punish someone who attempts to trample my rights. And since all my rights are transferable, including the higher order rights, and since there's safety in numbers, then it's rational for me to transfer that right, the right to enforce my rights, that is the right to punish, to an organization which undertakes to protect my other rights. And that's how Nozick gets to the mineral state. Okay, so is there a moral to my story? Well, the thought is that natural rights began as natural rightnesses, right? That this became conflated with ownership at some point, that this ownership was extended to inalienability, that this inalienability was restricted by a right to punish, and that in the end, this gave us an argument, perfectly consistent argument, given those premises, for a minimal state. Thanks. Whoop. Well, I think you're still, yeah, there you are.
Thank you very much, Calvin. You've given us a lot to chew on. We've gone through, I guess, roughly a millennium in the of an hour or less. Questions, anyone? I think I can't see everybody on my screen at the same time, so well, Calvin, it would probably help us if you took out your screen share now.
All right, yeah, let me do that right away. Did I succeed yet? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Is Michael here? I don't see Michael.
Michael, just give me a second here, and I'll get rid of this screen share.
Can people unmute themselves, Michael?
Yeah, I turned off the screen share, and everyone can unmute themselves.
Great.
Thanks, Michael.
I think we probably, in an orderly way, can just say, you know, if you'd like to ask a question or even make a comment, just speak up, and if two people come at the same time, you know, we'll take one and then we'll go with the other.
So to what extent is the idea of rights in all these thinkers contingent on the notion of there being some superhuman power that grants them? Is that an essential notion in rights theorization as you've described it?
Well, it's a tricky question. Let me explain. So in the Stoic picture, which I think underlies, for example, Cicero's way of thinking about this, you've got something that's superhuman. Of course, it's not personal or anything like that. It is rationality immanent in nature. It's in the universe itself. Now, of course, that gets personalized when you get to the Abrahamic religions. And I didn't say anything about you know, the notion of a mitzvah in Jewish law, for example, or anything about what goes on in Islamic law, or in jurisprudence in fiqh, right? So there it gets personalized. But what's really crucial is that there be something which is not yours. So in Kant, for example, I didn't say anything about this, you get this idea of reason with a capital R, and what reason with a capital R dictates. Now, it's superhuman in one sense, right? It's not a feature of any particular mind or anything like that, but it's not exactly divine either. So I guess the short answer is yes, there is always in the background something super or supra-human, but it need not be a set of commandments. Can I just say one more thing about this? So one of the notions that came up very briefly in my talk, but didn't get developed, is the notion of an obligation. Now, Some contemporary to us writers, Elizabeth Anscombe, for example, who's no longer alive, but was, not that long ago, wrote a lovely paper called Modern Moral Philosophy, in which she argues that the notion of obligation depends upon something suprahuman in this sense. Actually, she thought probably on an Abrahamic God, but and so if it turned out that you couldn't make sense of the notion of a suprahuman whatnot, then you'd have to give up the notion of obligation. And she thought this would be a radical shift in ethics. I don't think she's right about that, but I do think that that once you have the notion of an obligation on the table, you have a more sort of clear picture of something suprahuman going on.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, obviously there have been and there are philosophers who are, let's say, atheists who don't believe that there's anything outside of the natural realm, who believe that there are obligations of all sorts, and I mean, in the 20th century, for a long time, the sort of basic, or one of the key moral question was, can ought be derived from is, and right. It's a difficult problem. I mean, it was regarded, I think, by most philosophers for a while as no, it can't be. And obviously there have been and are a lot of philosophers and people who disagree with that. But it is a difficulty, isn't it? Because if we're talking about natural right or natural law, if the order that we live in is purely material, it is difficult to think about how any notion of prescription, as you said, as opposed to description, comes into it.
Yeah, I mean, so there are some very complex issues here. Let me let me signal a couple of them. I probably can't do more than that. So one thought is that there is an objective order, let me call it suprahuman, right? Of norms, that we can discover in the same way that we might, discover the basic structure of matter. Okay, so there's a kind of realism for you. At the other extreme, what you get is the thought that norms just express people's preferences and there's nothing more to it. Now, there are various intermediate positions. One of them that is, I think, particularly interesting, I'm not sure it's right, but I think it's particularly interesting, is that norms can be generated in interpersonal contexts. There was a paper by the, I think now slightly disgraced, but very brilliant philosopher John Searle, who on how it is that the institution of promising, for example, which is a social institution, it can only grow up inside a social context, can nonetheless generate obligations. That is, if in the appropriate context I promise you something, I have an obligation. That was the thought. So on this picture, this intermediate picture, you don't need to suppose that there's, so to speak, built right into nature itself a structure of norms, but you do have to regard them as somehow interpersonal, in the sense that they arise in not from any particular individual's preferences or anything like that, but in a wider context. Now, I haven't taken a stand on any of that. When I was asked there a second ago whether there's something suprahuman, I was trying to fudge it by there's something, I think the notion does depend on there being something which is not, so to speak, up to me. Now, whether it could be up to us collectively is another story. And indeed, in antiquity, there was this moving back and forth between talking about the jus naturale, and the jus gentium, the us of the peoples, right? And so people would say things like, oh, if everybody agrees that it's wrong to kill an innocent person, okay, so that's part of the jus gentium. And others would say, no, it's part of the jus naturale. Take your pick, right? So I think they were unclear, and it's probably built into the very idea from the built into the history of the very idea that people have not been sharp about whether or not they thought they were committed to, a god or an immanent order of nature, or just to the jus gentium. What people everywhere agreed on, or something like that.
Any other questions or comments?
If I may, Professor Lowenstein.
Yeah, we'll go Tanya and then Tom, okay?
Thank you. I'm sorry, I can't see everybody on my screen. If I may add to that, when speaking of the Declaration of Independence, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think that the natural law in particular references life, but the jus gentium may reference liberty. Do you have a moment to expound upon that? Any of your thoughts?
I mean, you might well be right. I don't have anything very helpful to say here, because if you look, for example, at say Hobbes's picture, right? Hobbes thinks that we all have a permission to. Well, let me back up. Hobbes thinks that we have that we have what I would call something close to an obligation, although he would never use that word, to preserve our life. That is, we don't have a choice about that. I think Hobbes thinks it's not. I don't know whether you'd say it's because we're just built that way, or whether it's a normative matter. But Hobbes does not think that it's up to, that say suicide is something that one might simply do, right? Okay, so life has this. Life presses us. We're obligated, in some funny sense of obligated, to preserve our life. Now, Hobbes draws from that the conclusion that we have a permission, in my sense, that is a privilege in Hofeld's sense, to do whatever is required to preserve our life. So he's getting the liberty out of the life, if you like, right? So he, I think, is thinking that the liberty comes with the natural right, or law, if you prefer that language. He uses law quite often. Now, others don't go straightforwardly there, but you'll notice, for example, that this thought that someone can sell themselves into slavery, right? That thought that's up to you is read by people like Locke as meaning that one can give up one's life. So they too are drawing this very intimate connection between whatever your, whatever the status of your life is for you and the status of your liberty is for you. So I guess I'm not sure that one could distinguish these very clearly.
May I ask a follow-up question? And that is simply, sure. How would you define liberty?
Oh, I wouldn't. I mean, there's another story, right? I mean, it's, liberum and libertas have a long history themselves, but I think it's part of at least of the conception that that there's no compulsion involved here, right? So that in the case of having a liberty, there's nothing external to whatever you're talking about, which dictates how it will be used, something like that.
Okay, Tom.
Hi, Calvin. Thank you for the lecture. So, if I understand, of course, my question is going to be about Aquinas, but if I understand, if I understand how you were describing him correctly, you were saying something along the lines that for him, right and justice are more or less the same thing. And there's a passage in the Nicomachean Ethics, or his commentary in the Nicomachean Ethics, that seems to support that. And I'll put the Latin in the chat but the translation that I have goes, he, Aristotle, rejects an error opposed to the division. He says first that there is a twofold division of political justice, natural justice, and legal justice. This is the same as the division that the jurists make, namely that one kind of right is natural and the other positive. They call right the very thing that Aristotle calls the just object. And then he says, Isidore says that, or he calls right and justice the same thing too. So it seems like Aquinas is acknowledging at least that there are two different words, but he thinks that they mean the same thing.
Well, hang on. So, I mean, there's what the text that you put up says is that there's a justus, a legale, and a justus naturale, right? But justus, of course, has jus just as its root, right? And so I don't think these are very different words in a certain sense. And if you looked at the text that I put up from the Summa, there what he says is there what he does is he identifies the justum and the jus. He says they're the same. Maybe I can, if I can take 1 second, I'll put that up again just so you can see what I have in mind. Let me go back now. I've got to okay, I'll just go back. This won't take long, folks, I hope. Yeah. See, so he says, justice has as an object the justum, which is the same as jus. So, oops, I pressed the button I shouldn't have pressed. So I take it that in the passage that you put up from the commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, he's making essentially the same claim, right? He's claiming, yes, there's a justus or justum, I guess it's probably neuter, right? Which comes from the law, and there's one which comes from nature, and what these are the same, maybe, but those are two different sources, but they're both cases of the justum, i.e., as the Summa would say, of a jus. So that's what I think.
Yeah, but a follow-up, I'm wondering though, so if rights for Aquinas is just, he goes, well, rights, that's just justice. That's the same as justice. I kind of wonder if there isn't, because we were talking about, right seems to have this additional sort of focus on freedom of choice, and the freedom to do or to not to do. And I wonder if there could be a case made that rights, as we understand it, is in a way justice without the teleology. I mean, I know that's
No, I think I see what you mean. And Aquinas is actually, I think, a kind of interesting case here, because at least a lot of the scholarship has focused on the following thought. In fact, I think Juliet Evans, in a book of hers on natural rights, says that we should not speak of rights in Aquinas. We should speak of our rights, right? Things are our right. That's her way of thinking of it. So the justum is what's a right? It's what's correct. It's what's right. And Aquinas does suggest that we have a dominium, and that's why I brought this in over things to which he's prepared to say we have also a jus. But it's not crystal clear to me that he simply identifies the dominium and the jus. I think you have to go a generation later to find people just identifying them, like Godfrey, I think. saying that wherever there's a dominium, there's a jus. Wherever there's a jus, there's a dominium, right? So I think Aquinas is an interesting case. He's trying to bring together, two traditions, a philosophical tradition and a jurisprudential tradition, and to see them against a certain background. And I don't know whether the right thing to say is maybe he never finished it, or maybe it's too subtle for anything I've been able to make out yet. He's a subtle guy. So short, he does not draw the straightforward connection between ownership and jus that later people do, but he seems to go further than simply suggesting that a jus has nothing to do with ownership. That's my thought.
Okay, any other questions, comments? Thank you, Calvin.
Professor?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Excuse me, there's actually a question in the chat that I'm going to read. This is from Ken Weatherwax.
Yeah.
Ken says, I'm glad to finally know what the Franciscan-Dominican debate setting in Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose was based upon, since it was clearly based upon the Franciscans and Aquinas' debate on property under Pope John. Anyway, my question is, you identify the issue of whether one may give up one's natural rights, such as life, or not. A similar debate exists in intellectual property rights. American intellectual property law, statutory and judicial, provides, with very rare exceptions, that an inventor or creator may voluntarily alienate all of her IP rights to her inventions or creations. In contrast, European IP statutes or treaties provide that there are certain IP rights, dubbed moral rights, that inventors or creators cannot give up even if they want to. Do you take any position on whether you think that natural rights are trending toward complete voluntary alienability or the opposite?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Thank you, Ken. Well, of course, by the way, Aquinas was dead by the time that the poverty controversy got going, but his successors in the Dominican order certainly carried on his view, and Pope John is reflecting that, I think. Okay, now as for your actual question, I don't know where I mean. That will depend on I think issues about which kind of how powerful the EU is after Brexit, how powerful the sort of intellectual picture that the United States has projected will be after a year or two from now, and so I don't have a view about that. What I do think is that these reflect very different pictures of the relationship between a person and the person's mind. So I think what's going on in some sense is that what the Europeans think that you can't give up your intellectual property rights because in a way that would be giving up your mind. And American law doesn't try to go down that road, right? It wants to claim that you have an inalienable right maybe to, as you say, life, liberty, although exactly how that's played out is an interesting question, and maybe the pursuit of happiness, although whatever that comes to. But everything else is transferable. And so if it contributes to your happiness to sell your algorithm to Google, you can perfectly well do it, right? I mean, there's no... So I think the question of who will win is probably one I haven't any insight into at all. But I do think that it will reflect two different pictures of the relationship between persons and their intellects.
I can just follow up on that point. That's always been a contrast between Anglo-American law and continental law as to inheritance, how much a testator, how much autonomy in devising wealth as opposed to how much the state can regulate. So that's very interesting that intellectual property is falling into that same trap.
Yeah, and this, by the way, is this also has a history. I mean, of course, in England, the entailment of estates was often very common, right, for a long time. But the history there has to do with what Adam could do with his property, right? Could he, for example, so people inherit their property on this picture, on the Dominion picture, if you like, from Adam. And now the question is, could they alienate it? Well, you saw, for example, the thought that one couldn't alienate what one had in, according to the natural right or the natural law. And if you thought then that property was somehow tied up with that, then you'd get some restrictions. One restriction that everybody bought, as far as I can tell, until maybe very recently, even Locke and I think Nozick buys this too, is that if somebody is in extremis, they have a permission to take what's needed to sustain their life. The Jean Valjean picture is sort of very deep. That's deep in medieval conceptions that you simply can't alienate whatever claim you might have had to the common, whatever that was, in such a way that it will undermine your claim to your life.
Okay, it's now 9:09 in California. It's after midnight on the East Coast. I think we have at least one or two people from there. In the Midwest, it's pretty late too. So I think this is probably a good time to wind it up. I'll just thank you again, Calvin, for bringing us to some material that is quite rich and quite interesting. And some of you who are here will be in the seminar on Saturday. For those of you who are in California, wherever you are, but if you're used to our usual schedule, please remember that this one is starting in California at 4:00 p.m., which I think is it 9 o'clock in Brisbane?
Not anymore. It's now 10 o'clock because Brisbane doesn't change its time, but the US does.
Okay. So I look forward to seeing you people then. And for the rest of you, we'll be back next year. Watch for an announcement of our winter spring events. If you're not on the CLAFI distribution list, just send me or Ishani an email and we'll take care of you. And have a great evening and a great weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Calvin.